Good morning, everybody. Good to see you today. Thanks for being here for this time of Bible study. We're studying Romans. We're studying it verse by verse. Remember that there are some difficult passages in Romans, and so we're going to try to make our very best sense of that. But we're also not going to let anything in Romans contradict something that we know someplace else in Scripture that we plainly understand elsewhere in Scripture. As I said last week, this is an overriding principle of Bible study. We can't interpret passages in such a way that they contradict each other. That just doesn't work. God doesn't give contradictory messages. So whatever this verse means, it has to harmonize with another verse. That being the case, if we got a verse that we understand very well, that's easy to understand, then we can use it as a commentary on one that's maybe harder to understand. And so that's the principle that we sort of apply when we get to some tough verses. And I think we got a couple of tough verses looking at us right now in chapter 2. So kind of keep this picture in mind. Chapter 1, the last half of chapter 1, Paul was describing the horribly, morally corrupt Gentile world. In the last half of chapter 1, where he talks about, that section where he so plainly denounces homosexuality, but then he talks about a whole host of other sins that the Gentile world was involved in. When we get to chapter 2 now, he begins to sort of transition to talk about not just the Gentiles, really all men are subject to God and subject to God's judgment. And so he kind of view the first part of the chapter as transitioning. By the time we get to the end of the chapter, he's going to be talking fully about the Jews, all right? So chapter 1 condemns the Gentiles. Chapter 2 moves to talking about the Jews. But the common thing is all are subject to God. Now, we talked about these verses last week, but I just want to review real quickly for sake of context. Notice, God is going to render to every man according to his deed. Tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil to the key, Jew first and also Gentile. Glory and honor and peace to every man that worketh good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. There's no respect of persons with God. Okay, so just so we're clear that we have the fact that he's talking about all men. He had already talked about Jews. He's transitioning to talk about the Jews. But I want you to really stress, so we get the point here. He's talking about Jew and Gentile. Okay. Now here's the verses that we ended up last week. For as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. I'll stop right here. If you're looking at a newer translation, like the New American Standard or the English Standard Version, it's going to have a definite article here with law. And I think that's really important. For as many as have sinned without the law shall perish without the law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. So the law that's under consideration there has to be the law of Moses, because he's talking about Jew and Gentile, right? So who would be those who sinned without the law? Well, that was the Gentiles, because the law of Moses wasn't given to them, right? They're going to perish without the law. They're still going to be judged by God, but they're not dealing with the law of Moses. The Jews, those who sinned in the law, that would have to be Jews, right? Are going to be judged by the law. So the reason I showed you those previous verses, Jew and Gentile, you're talking about Jew and Gentile. There's no respect of persons with God. Therefore, as many as have sinned without the law of Moses will perish without the law of Moses, and many as have sinned in the law of Moses shall be judged by the law of Moses. Okay? Now, as I told you last week, observe the parenthetical of verses 13, 14, and 15. Hold that and jump right down here to the end of that. So, as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. As many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. All right? So the principle is all are subject, Jew and Gentile alike. Whether the law of Moses pertained to you or not, you are going to be judged by God. God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. So now, and of course this is a principle that he's going to develop more fully throughout the whole epistle. Now we're all subject to the gospel of Christ, right? Jew and Gentile alike. So, all right. So now let's get rid of some of this. But I really believe that the law that he's talking about there has to be the law of Moses, and I do think it's significant that well here he uses the definite article the law, but up here newer translations include the definite article. He's talking about the law of Moses. All right, now let's catch this parenthetical thought. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. We know that, right? As we said last week, that's very similar to James chapter 1, verse 22. Don't be hearers only, but doers of the word. Now here's the question. The hard part here is in 14 and 15. For when the Gentiles which have not the law, Gentiles have not the law. What is that law? That's got to be the law of Moses, right? Gentiles don't have the law of Moses. The law of Moses was given to Jews. The Gentiles have not the law, but they do by nature the things contained in the law. They do by nature. The New American Standard Version right here says instinctively. When they instinctively do the things contained in the law, these having not the law are law unto themselves. So how would what would be an example of the Gentiles? The law of Moses wasn't given to the Gentiles. But they do instinctively some of the things that the law of Moses taught, right? What would be an example of that? Don't murder.
Huh?
Don't murder.
Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't
Okay.
covet.
Okay.
Don't commit adultery.
So
Honor your mother and father.
there's some things that are just, as human beings, we instinctively understand, right? You could even go to a hardcore prison, and if you interviewed the inmates, they know that it's wrong to murder. They may be in there for murder, but they understand that's not normal. That's not normal human behavior. That's not what you're supposed to do. There's something in it. There's a moral code. One of the things that we use to argue even the existence of God is that he instilled in us a basic moral code, an instinctive moral code that doesn't exist in the animal world. So in the animal world, what's the rule? Survival of the fittest. If I'm bigger and stronger than you, I'll kill you and eat you. That's what do we count them do we count a lion, for instance, as being an immoral creature because he kills and eats his prey? No. That's by nature. That's his nature. That's what he does instinctively. But we don't do that. So what happens when an animal in the wild, when an animal gets old and sick, what happens? The other animals either kill it or just abandon it. They're not going to take care of it, right? What do? We take care of our old and sick. How did we come by that? I remember years ago we interviewed a famous atheist on the Virtual Bible Study named Dan Barker. And I thought it was pretty telling. One of the questions I asked him, he could not answer. I said, why do we take care of our old and sick people? Because that doesn't help us evolutionary wise. That doesn't advance the species when we take care of our old sick people. Why don't we just let them die off? He couldn't answer that. How did we develop, in an evolutionary sense, how did we develop that tendency? Because it's not helpful. In an evolutionary sense, it's not helpful. Why do we do that? Well, he said, best I can come up with is because I would like to be treated that way when I get old and need help. Oh, well, me too. But that doesn't answer the question. In an evolutionary sense, there's no value to taking care of your sick and elderly. Let them die. They're dragging us down. Where did we get this nature? Where did this instinctive nature come from? I think Paul is arguing here that God instilled in man, all men, an instinctive nature that causes anybody, whether they were either subject to the law of Moses back then or not, they knew it was wrong to murder. They knew it was wrong to steal. There's just some instinctive sense of that. And I believe that's what he's describing here. Eric?
In addition to that, didn't they also have some other sort of law from God that we don't know about?
I think that's really a good point. God was dealing with the Gentile nations, although the Old Testament doesn't give us a lot of that information. The Old Testament is primarily an account, a historical account of God dealing with the Jews, the descendants of Abraham. But we know, and I think Eric's making a great point here, we know that God at the same time was dealing with the Gentile nations. Somebody give me a real easy example of that. JD?
I mean, one of them was, I'm thinking about Abraham when he lied about Sarah being his sister.
Abimelech knew that he shouldn't do that.
And he even said that he was that he was a king who was trying to do what God wanted him to do. And now here Abraham came in and tried to fool him.
And it could have gotten him in big trouble.
Right.
God will judge me for that. Who did you mention, Eric?
Jonah.
Absolutely, Jonah. Abraham was before the law of Moses, but Jonah was actually, during the time of the law of Moses, God was clearly dealing with the Ninevites. Remember, Jonah was sent to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and they were horrible people. And they were the big empire of the time, but they were horribly bloody bullies. When they conquered other nations, they did horrible atrocities. History records some of the just almost impossible to describe atrocities that they committed on the people that they defeated. God sent Jonah to Nineveh. The reason Jonah ran away and tried to go the other way on the ship to Tarshish, not because he was afraid of the Ninevites. He went the other way because he did not want them to hear the message of God. He did not want them to repent. He wanted God to punish them. Well, he finally got there, and what does it say? Jesus said, the Ninevites repented at the preaching of Jonah. Matthew 12, verse 41.
Here, Paul's writing to these Christians. The gospel being done and spread to it. Is he talking about from this time on? Because it's sort of hard to wrap around. How are they subject to the gospel of Christ if they had heard the gospel of Christ prior to Christ coming?
I don't think he's talking about in the past tense.
Okay, that's what.
Because
he's talking about right now, this time period.
Yeah.
There's no difference.
There's no way that God could judge. For instance, here let's take the great prophet Elijah. You know what Elijah never observed the first day of the week Lord's Supper. Well, we could send him to hell. He didn't observe the Lord's Supper. That's part of the law of Christ. Now, it couldn't possibly be that way. The law wasn't enforced yet. A law is enforced. What does the Hebrew writer say in Hebrews 9, verse 15? Hebrews 9:15. For this cause he, Jesus, is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, there's no strength at all while the testator liveth. So I think here he's got to be talking about right now, Jew and Gentile, and all are subject to God through the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think that's right. Just a little bit more here in this parenthetical section. He's talking about the Gentiles. They show the work of the law written in their hearts. I think that's the key phrase right here, really. A law written in their hearts. Again, I think that goes to this instinctive nature that God has instilled in us. From time to time, we're called upon to explain What's your proof? What's your line of reasoning that there is a God in heaven? Well, we talk about design demands a designer and all those kind of things. But one of the things that we argue is this moral nature of man that doesn't exist in the animal world. And how did we get it? And there's no way, without God, there's really no way to explain how man came up with this basic moral nature. There's just no explanation of that. It doesn't fit. And if it's evolution falls here. Evolution doesn't work. Evolution does not explain why we have this instinctive moral nature. That argues to a God who put it in us. Mike?
When Adam and Eve ate of that forbidden fruit, man's always had the knowledge of good and evil from that time on.
All right. I think you're right. Wade?
I think you could probably argue, and there's probably over 1,000 languages, or maybe 3,000 languages in existence today. So that would mean probably 3,000 different cultures or more. I think you could probably argue, and I couldn't go back and tell you that every one of them had this, but I think that I could probably argue that all of these cultures have some laws in place against murder, against theft, against certain things that are instinctive. But why is that?
Yeah.
If it wasn't one common denominator, if it wasn't the fact that there was a God, why would they have those laws in place?
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. So I think this probably is the first difficult section that we're going to run into. We're going to run into several difficult sections in Romans. But I think these verses 13, 14, 15 are a little harder to understand. But again, let the context help us grasp what he's getting at. The context says, as many as have sinned, God shall judge. Jew or Gentile. As many as have sinned, God will judge. The Jews had the law of Moses. Didn't have that, but they're going to be judged too, because there was rules for them to observe too. Rules that came just by the instinctive nature that God instilled in them. Rules that came, although we don't have the full picture, as we said, rules that came by the fact that God was dealing with those non-Jews all during that same time period. JD?
If you read like some commentaries and things about that, the way it's been presented, and I think it's probably okay, is to basically say that, the Gentiles essentially, before the law of Moses came, it was the patriarchal period. And it seems like essentially with a lot of the Gentiles, with a few examples we have sprinkled through the Old Testament, it seems like that's how God continued to deal with them, which is to talk to, the heads of their families or their kings, because it's sprinkled throughout there. There's always, you come through with the knowledge that those people had some kind of a communication from God and knew that they were supposed to act in certain ways, even if they refused to do it.
Yeah. We oversimplify it when we say patriarchal, Mosaic, Christian, 3 dispensations. Well, that's fine if you're talking about the descendants of Abraham. For the descendants of Abraham, that's the way it went. Patriarchal, Mosaic, Christian. But that's an oversimplification, because the Gentiles weren't under that Mosaic system. And so you're excluding a whole lot of the world's population if you just look at that picture, that oversimplified picture. Tom?
Look at Job. We see Job probably was a contemporary of Abraham, but he wasn't a descendant of Abraham. Yet, we cannot deny that his relationship with God was on par with Abraham as well.
Yeah, exactly right.
And we don't have his lineage listed for us that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
So, here we have an individual that, as we classify, would be a Gentile, because he's not descendant of Abraham, but in that aspect.
So he would have been a patriarch, and God was dealing with the patriarch.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Sarah?
In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 through 22, where he's talking about to the Jews, I became a Jew. In verse 21, it says, to those who were without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. When he says, I'm not without the law of God there, is he talking about the moral code, do you think? Or is he, because he's not,
Oh.
how do I live?
No.
He's saying, when I'm with the Jews, I follow the
Yeah.
My question is, what is the law of God there?
It's been a while since I looked at that, Sarah, but I'm going to just, as I recall, I think he's talking about, again, Jew-Gentile distinction. And we know that Paul did honor the Jewish customs. You know, when he went back to Jerusalem, when he got arrested, he was in the temple purifying himself according to Jewish custom. So as a Jew, he still kept the customs of the Jews. When he was with the Gentiles, he observed their customs. And so I think that's what he's talking about. I think that's the law there, is also the law of Moses that he's talking about when he talks about those without the law and those who were under the law. I think he's going to talk about the law of Moses. All right, anything else? All right, again, I think these are kind of a tough section of verses, but again, if you want to, just eliminate the parenthetical section, which is the harder part to understand, and get the main gist of it. As many as have sinned, God will judge. And the judgment is going to be by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Okay? All right. Now, as we move to verse 17, the next paragraph, he has fully now switched over. Remember, I always think it's kind of helpful to see a sort of, I don't know, sort of a construction of his argument, sort of see the way he's laying. These are not just random verses thrown out there at just willy-nilly. He's building a case here. And the case he's building in chapter 1, the Gentile world is corrupt and fully to be judged because of that corruption. First part of chapter 2, but actually that's not just the Gentiles who are going to be judged by God. Jew and Gentile alike are accountable to God. And so the first part of chapter 2 sort of transitions. Now, by the time we get to verse 17 of chapter 2, he's going to be fully talking about the Jews and the situation they were in. Chapter 2, verse 17, Behold, thou art called a Jew, and resteth in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth of the law. All right. So here's how the Jews viewed themselves. And they're pretty proud about this situation, actually. They went by the name Jew. Thou art called a Jew. They were very proud of that they had this Jewish ancestry. They could connect all the way back to Abraham. They knew their genealogy. You know, people today study genealogies. Have you ever? I don't know any of you. If you do it, you haven't told me about it. But there are people who are really into genealogical studies. You know, you can get online now, and there are all kind of tools online where you can trace your ancestors back to who knows when. And some people really get deeply into that. Well, that's not a new thing. The Jews were like that. They were very proud of their ancestry. They knew their ancestry. They could trace themselves back, generation after generation, and they were proud of it. Thou art called a Jew. You're pretty proud of that, aren't you? That you could be called a Jew. The King James uses the word restest. Thou resteth in the law. Newer versions like the English Standard Version, New American Standard Version says rely upon. Rely upon. You can't read my writing. I'm sure I can't read my writing. So the word resteth there in the King James. You rely upon the law and you make your boast of God. The Revised Standard Version says you boast of your relation with God. So he's describing the Jews. They're proud of their name. They relied upon the law of Moses. They boasted about the relationship that they had with God. Okay? You knowest his will. Well, they did. They had the law of Moses. You know what? They knew what God wanted. They approved of the things that are more excellent. The word approve here suggests the idea that they had seen the benefits of, or they had tested and were aware of. They were fully, based upon their experience, they knew that this was good. The law of Moses is good. Dealing with God according to the law of Moses is a positive thing. And so they approved, or by experience knew things more excellent, being instructed out of the law. Again, the law of Moses, right? Has to be the law of Moses here. So get the idea. Here's the Jew. How does he feel about all this business? Well, he's proud to be a Jew. He relies on the law. He boasts about his relationship with God. He knows the will of God, and he has approved, or that is, he has tested and seen that the law of God is excellent. He's been instructed in the law. Notice they had a confidence. Thou art confident that thou art a guide of the blind and a light to them in darkness. No, those Gentiles, they don't. If they only knew what I know, they don't have this knowledge that I possess, because I'm a Jew, and I know the law of God, and I've been able to test and approve that these things are excellent. And if I could guide them, I could be a guide of the blind, a light to them in darkness. I could instruct those foolish people. I could teach babies. I have the knowledge of the truth in the law. So again, this all goes to the confidence that the Jews had in their relationship with God. Any thoughts on those verses? I think they're pretty straightforward. Again, just phrase after phrase describing the mental attitude of the Jews. Remember, the Jews were the ones who in chapter 1 were condemning those Gentiles. Oh, those Gentiles are horrible people, but we're not. We're better than they are. And here's some of that idea. We're better than they are. Now, keep going in verse 21, chapter 2, verse 21. Thou therefore that teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. Now he drives his point home, right? So you've got all this abundant confidence in your relationship with God, and yet, and you think you're a qualified teacher of others, right? But thou which teachest another, teachest not thyself? How is it that you think you know so much and would be willing to teach it others, and you haven't even learned well yourself? And then he gives several examples. You preach that a man should not steal. Do you steal? You say a man should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You abhor idols. Dost thou commit sacrilege? And of course, these are all right. These are all rhetorical questions, and the answer to them here is yes. They teach others not to steal. They do steal. They teach others not to commit adultery. They do commit adultery. They teach others to abhor idols. This is kind of really interesting. I had to do a little searching to figure this out. My understanding here is, and some newer translations will translate it this way. You say you abhor idols. Do you rob temples? Well, you know, there's been a lot written in history, and even books written, movies made about those who would raid temples and try to get the treasures that were in pagan temples, because the pagans did that. You know, they would ordain. Well, the Jews did that. The temple in God's temple in Jerusalem was just, everything was overlaid with gold. Well, the pagans did that with their idol temples too. You know, they adorned them with all kinds of valuables. So what's he meaning here? You who abhor idols, teach men to abhor idols. Teach men that they should not serve idols. Do you rob temples? Well, I don't think he's talking about robbing temples literally. I think he's talking about taking advantage, making personal gain from the practice of idolatry. And so, you know, the Jews were telling their Gentile counterparts, you shouldn't worship idols. And yet they were positioning themselves to benefit from the practice of idolatry, monetarily enriching themselves perhaps by those who practiced idolatry. So again, he's just showing the rank hypocrisy of the Jews. In that previous paragraph, all the great confidence, oh, we know God, we have a relationship with God, we have the law, we understand things, we can teach others. Now Paul says, well, you who have all that confidence that you're able to teach others, why aren't you teaching yourselves? You teach others not to steal, but you steal. You teach others not to commit adultery, but you commit adultery. You teach others to abhor idols, but you yourselves benefit, have made it so that you benefit from the practice of idolatry. They boast in the law, but through breaking the law, they were dishonoring God. So they boasted of the law, but they were guilty of breaking the law, and in doing so, they dishonored God. For notice, and when they did that, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you. So here's the Jew who has such great confidence. Man, I got a relationship with God. You don't. But because of the corrupt lives they were living, the Gentiles were saying, I don't care for what you've got. If that's what it is to have a relationship with God that you brag about, I don't want anything to do with that. I think there's a pretty good takeaway right here for us. And we're not Jews. We don't live under the law of Moses. We don't make the same kind of boast that they did. But I think it's very possible that if we don't live up to what we preach, that's what the Jews were doing right here. They weren't living up to what they preached, right? Wouldn't if you just wanted to boil that down in a nutshell, wouldn't you say that Paul is saying, you Jews, you brag so much, but you're such gross hypocrites. You don't live by what you preach. You don't practice what you preach. That's our expression, right? You don't practice what you preach. And because you don't practice what you preach, the Gentiles are blaspheming God because of you. Couldn't that be true for us? I mean, isn't it definitely true of us? If we don't practice what we preach, unbelievers are going to blaspheme God. They don't care to have any part of what we're doing. Sue Ann?
When you go back and read Malachi 3, God is warning them about all of these things, and he said, you did all these sins because you did not fear me.
Yeah. And it was the same kind of situation that Paul's describing here, don't you think? Yeah, good point. Tom?
Chapter 6, he really goes on about discussion of grace. He says, shall we continue in sin that grace be abound? Let it never be. It was sort of that situation. You continue sin, the thing that you hope is going to take care of you isn't going to take care of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right. So, would you agree with me that in this section, Paul has identified who he's talking about in the previous paragraph, and in this paragraph, man, he nails them, doesn't he? He drives the stake home. You got no reason to be feeling good about your relationship with God when you are practicing such rank hypocrisy. That's basically what he says, right? So, all are subject to the law of God. Certainly the corrupt Gentiles are, but you Jews, he says, you Jews, you are too. You're just as condemnable as the Gentiles are, is his point. Let's read on, verse 29. Yes.
I really see your point, and I think it's really easy to be a judge of other people.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how people want to serve. They want to be Christians because I've got a girl that I work with. She's got tattoos all over, and her hair's cut differently. And I don't know. I had a guy come in Friday, and he was asking her about coming to church with me. And but he really pressed the point. And boy, it just made her so mad. And she just said, I don't want to go to church because every time I go to church, people look funny at me. They always look at me differently. It makes me feel uncomfortable. And so, I think that it's easy for us to do that, in the church, any church. It's easiest for us to look at ourselves and say, we're trying really hard to do what God wants us to do. And then when somebody comes in like that, instead of saying, looking at it like Jesus looks at it and said, this is a soul. This is a soul that needs saving. We oftentimes look at those people and judge them based upon their appearance.
Yeah. Of course, the main thing, Jesus condemned hypocrisy more than anything else. Jesus' strongest words were in condemnation of hypocrisy. And that's what Paul's dealing with here, the hypocrisy of the Jews. And so get the lesson. But I really do think that this last expression in verse 24, because of the hypocrisy of the Jews, the name of God was being blasphemed among the Gentiles. And that certainly could be the case with us. If we're not living true to what we claim to believe, if we're not practicing what we preach, unbelievers who are like the Gentiles in this verse, unbelievers are going to blaspheme the name of God because of us. Man, we don't want to go there, right? We don't want that to happen for sure. All right, let's read to the end of the chapter here, verse 20 through verse 29. For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision does transgress the law? For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not of God, not of men, but of God. Okay, let's hold off on those verses just for a minute. Let's get to the conclusion, right? 4. That's drawing a conclusion based upon what he's been arguing, right? For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly. Now notice how he's using the word Jew here. The word Jew here has to do with one who's right with God, one who's in a relationship with God. So here he's using Jew in a symbolic way, not in a literal, but in a figurative way. Who is a Jew? Who is a Jew anyway? Using the word Jew to mean one in a relationship with God, one who knows God, one who's in a relationship with God. Who is this person who's a Jew these days? Not one who is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh. Now, the Jews were still meticulous about observing the practice of circumcision, right? They believed it was so absolutely necessary. And it was under the law. Under the law of Moses, circumcision absolutely was necessary. We know that law has been abolished by this point in time. But they were still taking confidence in the fact that they, even their bodies, their physical bodies showed, they claimed, that they had this relationship with God. We circumcise our male babies. Therefore, obviously, we are the people of God. Obviously, we know God. Paul says, no. One is not a Jew. Again, the use of the terminology here has to be figurative, right? One is not a Jew just because he's circumcised in the flesh. It's not the outward appearance of the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly. And the circumcision is that of the heart in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men but of God. So he's saying, you Jews have a false sense of confidence. Remember, that's what he was saying. You've been very hypocritical in all your dealings, and you have a false sense of confidence in this relationship you have with God. But remember now, by the time this Roman letter was written, the law of Moses had been out for 30 years. The law of Moses was nailed to the cross of Jesus, right? Colossians 2, 14 through 16. The law of Moses has been abolished. They're still taking their confidence in that law which had been abolished. This statement, what he says right here in 28 and 29, would not have been true 50 years earlier. 50 years earlier, if you were a Jew, you had to show it outwardly, circumcision of the flesh, right? Because that law was still in effect 50 years ago. But it's been abolished now for 30 years, thereabouts, when Paul writes this. And so now again, this goes to the question Tom was asking earlier. He's talking about right now. He's talking about here and now. Here and now, you are not a Jew because you're a descendant of Abraham. You're not a Jew because you've been circumcised in the flesh. The Jew, figuratively speaking, today is one who is one inwardly, who has had the circumcision of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter. I'm talking about the letter of the law of Moses, whose praise is not of men, but whose praise comes from God. So, we're out of time. We'll try to come back and pick up these other verses. We'll try to resume our study there next Sunday. But let me ask you this question. Are you a Jew? How would you answer that question if someone says, are you a Jew?
No, not a literal Jew.
You're not a literal Jew. But you could say, in a figurative sense, yes, right? From these verses, we are the spiritual children of God. We are the spiritual Jews. We're not physical Jews, but we're Jews in the heart. We've had the circumcision of the heart, right? All right, good comments. Thanks, everybody. Lord willing, we'll pick it up there next Lord's Day.